Welcome to the HMO Property Show by investors for investors. Brought to you by the HMO Property Co, Australia's leaders in impact investing. Investments made with the intention to generate a measurable, beneficial social or environmental impact alongside a positive financial return. Catch us weekly as we discuss all things cash flow positive property investing.
Welcome back to the HMO Property Show. I'm your host, as always, Neil Gibb, and today after a lot of questions that are getting asked in this area, I've brought on the biggest SDA property manager in Western Australia. It's Mr. Perry Kleppe from GR8. Perry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. They actually call us providers in the NDIS. Providers. We are, for all intent and purpose, property managers, yes, but you might hear them referred to as SDA providers.
SDA providers, cool. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for clearing that up. That's the first thing, because the NDIS is an acronym for the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
Correct, yeah.
And included in the NDIS is probably 150 other acronyms that I think we're going to try and debunk during this episode.
Yes, well, let's just focus on the ones that are probably used most, I'd say, is probably the way to go with that.
Yeah, yep. Definitely. And obviously, with the HMO Property Core, in the HMO space, we're all about cash flow positive, delivering quality accommodation so that the investor wins and the tenant wins. And this is exactly where we are in the NDIA space as well, isn't it?
It is. It's probably a little bit more complicated, though, with this NDIS and in particular SDA, but I think we'll probably pick that up further on in this chat as well, about what I call the hierarchy of importance.
Yes.
And that really, if you can get your hierarchy of importance correct, you will have a very successful portfolio of NDIS property.
Beautiful. I'm going to make a note on that so we can touch on that later. But first of all, what is the NDIS?
Okay, look, it is, as you said, it is National Disability Insurance Scheme. It was a legislative framework that was established in Australia under the Julia Gillard government in 2013, and it is an extension, for want of a better description, to the Medicare system that deals with people living with disability. Mm-hmm. There's about 4.5 million people in Australia that have a disability of some kind, but about 450,000 of those will be on the NDIS. Mm-hmm. And then sort of boiling that down into that housing sector, 7% is the estimate of all the people on the NDIS will be eligible for funding for SDA accommodation, which is another one of those acronyms. So SDA is Specialist Disability Accommodation.
Right.
And probably what most of your people will be interested to know more about.
Yes, excellent. And the NDIA?
The NDIS is the legislative framework and governance, okay, and the NDIA is quite simply the administrative arm of it.
Right.
Okay, so the NDIA is the National Disability Insurance Agency.
Right.
So they are there to run and administer the NDIS.
Excellent. Yeah. So the opportunity for investors right now is to build specialist disability accommodation and then hand them over to someone like yourself as the NDIS provider, or SDA provider, and then you fill the tenant.
Correct.
Fill the rooms.
That's in its real simplest form. There is a lot of compliance around SDA, and look, it starts right from your planning stage. So it's not as simple as going to a builder and getting them to build you an SDA house. It needs to be involved with somebody. It comes back to this hierarchy of importance. Mm-hmm. We'll touch on it now then. The most important people in this whole process are people living with disability. And we've talked about yield, and a lot of people would think that this is very much a yield play. It's actually a people play, okay? It's a people and property play. It's a little bit different to your conventional property investment. So we see the hierarchy of importance as if you can first accommodate and deal with the importance and needs of the participants on the NDIS, and the next most important sector is what we call the SIL providers. So SIL is Specialist Independent Living Consultants. So these are the people who give the care and the support and look after the people in the houses. Yep. If the houses don't work very well, it makes the SIL job very hard. And it also means that your participants are probably going to come and go out of that house and not be long-term prospects. The third area of importance we see as being the SDA provider. Okay, if we can put together a property that covers off all the requirements of all the different categories that are involved, it's much easier to lease it. Okay. And the fourth most important person in the whole process, which is probably going to upset some of your people, is your investors. They're way down the line. But it's all about trying to not only maximise your yield, but maximising the stability of that yield. Okay. And if you can tick off those first three boxes, that you'll have that right.
So we need to reverse engineer it.
Very much so, yes. Very much so.
Well, I mean, we're thinking about the people with disabilities. So they get the funding from the NDIS to basically pick and choose wherever they want to live. Is that correct?
Dead right. The underlying criteria is what they call choice and control. They've moved the choice and control from the organisations that used to look after these people to the actual individuals who have the disability.
Fantastic. Yeah. And the people with disabilities are already living in certain areas now, or are they living in hospitals, aged care homes? Like, what's their current situation?
All of the above.
Yep.
Yeah, all of the above. Interesting, you should mention hospitals. We have recently housed a lady who has MS. She spent 8 weeks in a hospital in Bunbury and was then moved out to a hospital in Collie where she spent 11 months before accommodation was found. And when they finally did move her, the feeling that she had was that she'd been forgotten and put away, out of sight, out of mind, and there's just nothing available. Absolutely. The Perth market's a little bit behind the rest of the world.
Yeah. It's been going on the East Coast for quite a while now, hasn't it?
It has, and look, it's actually a positive. We've now got to see what not to do.
Learn from the mistakes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And before we start touching on the yields and the returns that we can get from these things, why is the government enticing investors to go out and build it? Why don't the government just build it themselves?
Well, they're not in the business of managing housing, firstly. And it is a significant impost on the public purse having to house these people themselves, because they will do it in places like nursing homes and hospitals and so forth. And the cost to the public purse is upwards of $2,500 per day.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're looking to incentivise the public sector to provide the housing with still highly attractive returns for them, but at a significant reduction to the government.
Yep. Yeah, interesting. So what are the different levels of care that are out there then? Because you touched on there, you said you build to the highest level so that you can accommodate all. Is that right?
Going back to these acronyms then, we've got SIL providers and we've got SDA providers. Yep. Now, under the legislation that's in place, it's very difficult to be both. It's deemed to be a conflict of interest. So in terms of level of care, from the SDA perspective, the design criteria vary along what's called improved livability, fully accessible, robust, and high physical support. In a really generalised description of that, improved livability is somebody who probably doesn't need a lot of care at all. Yep. It might be just intellectually disabled, Down syndrome, without trying to generalise it too much.
Yeah. So they can live on their own without care?
They probably still need someone just to pop in and clean and maybe cook now and then and just get them a bit organised. But there's no requirement generally for overnight care and having someone there 24/7. Okay. Fully accessible, it's probably now moving into mobility issues, and wheelchairs would be front of mind in that type of scenario. Robust is more behavioural based challenged people, so that's a different design criteria altogether. And last but not least is high physical support, and high physical support is where people require on-site, overnight, 24/7 care and support generally. Yep. It doesn't necessarily flow through like that in every single scenario. You can have someone who's high physical support who doesn't actually need any care and support, but that's just how they've been assessed and that's how they've been funded.
Right. Yeah. And the HPS, high physical support, they need a SIL provider on site to care for them, the ones that do need them?
Dead right. Yes, dead right. And those particular types of houses are then designed and constructed, or apartments as well, with what they call on-site overnight accommodation, which is really the operational centre, operational base for the SIL providers to deliver the care and the supports.
Right.
You might hear it referred to as OOA.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And who are some of the SIL providers that are out there? Who are the bigger names in the market that people might recognise?
That's a really good question. The West Australian sector has come from a position that's very entrenched. It was probably before the NDIS came in, it was a far superior disability model to any other state in Australia by a long way. And the larger SIL providers would be institutional type organisations. Some examples would be Rocky Bay, Nelson Group, and so forth. They are SIL providers as well. They're transitioning into this new model, but the future direction of SIL providers are people who have probably worked for these organisations before, who have now left and established their own businesses. They're popping up like mushrooms everywhere in WA, and a lot more nimble, dynamic, and just able to change direction very, very quickly and probably deliver levels of care and support, I think, that are much more economically delivered than some of the much larger ones.
Right, that's interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong, did you say before the NDIS came in there was a superior product available?
Well, the system that we had here it was basically a state-run system.
Right.
It was more of a block funding type of model, which was at odds with the NDIS system.
Right.
So under that block funding model, the state government gave these organisations big chunks of money, and it was basically left to them to deploy that money into providing care and support.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Generally speaking, a lot of the accommodation that was provided under that model doesn't meet the new requirements of the NDIS, which for the rest of the country has been a significant step up. Yeah. So we had to probably just come back a little bit to meet the standard.
Can existing properties be retrofitted to meet standard, or is new build the best way to go?
That's my opinion, is new build is the way to go. You get it right first up, and it fits in better with that hierarchy of importance as well. If you don't deliver a property that is recognised by your participant clients as being of a high quality, like people mix with like people, and it's no different with people living with disability. They're all interconnected, they're all talking and visiting each other, and if you've got a 1970s house with ramps and handrails and stuff to get access into the house, and they go and visit their friend in the next suburb who's living in a brand spanking new SDA compliant brand new house, they're going to go, I want to live in this.
Yeah.
And why am I living in that 1970s thing when I could be living in this?
And when somebody else is paying the rent.
Exactly. And it has no impact on them whatsoever. They can just up and go.
Yeah. So when you go back to the hierarchy of importance, it's all about delivering the best product for the person that's going to live there and thinking about the way they live.
Absolutely. Yes, dead right. And also how the support people, the SIL providers, are able to deliver that. So intuitive technology packages, assistive technology packages in the overall delivery of the housing product.
Yeah. What sort of tech are we seeing being put into these SDAs?
Automated doors, eye activated systems. Yeah. Obviously, the SIL provider, if they're living on site, needs to be interconnected, video and audio with the various rooms in case they need help in the night times. Adjustable bench top heights in kitchens.
Cool.
Just stuff like that.
Yeah. And
you've got to have onboard power as well in your house.
So there's if a power cuts.
Dead right.
Like battery backup.
Dead right. If you're delivering a high physical support package, which I would recommend everybody does, you've got to have onboard power for 2 hours. Okay, just to keep the systems operating. You might have somebody in there on a life support system or a semi-life support system, and you can't not have power.
Yeah, true.
But getting back to my point about I'd recommend everyone does something to high, if they're going to do this, they do it to high physical support. The reason there is if you have a participant who isn't high physical support, there's a very good chance they'll probably end up there. And if you haven't produced a product that actually meets that requirement, you'll lose your participant.
Is there a way we can kind of over-spec these properties for participants to live in so that they become more attractive?
It's actually, I think, something everyone should be doing. Yeah, without question. Without the knowledge of the being an SDA provider, I could see how someone could very easily go, well, if that's the requirement to meet compliance, that's what I'm going to do. But it's unlikely, though, that you'll probably attract your preferred clientele, which are high physical support, because they're the ones that pay the most, or the government pays the most through them. And it's not until you have the experience like an occupational therapist will actually visit that property before the participant actually has to make a decision on it, and they'll get their tape measure out and they'll do this and they'll do that, and they'll just go, this is just not suitable. And it's not suitable for any number of reasons, but generally speaking, if they are high physical support, it's doorways. Because a high physical support person is probably going to be predominantly in bed, and you cannot move a bed around a house. Yeah. So
we need wider doorways.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the compliant doorway is 950 mil from memory. Don't hold a gun to my head on that. But they're bigger than your standard doors, but they'll need to be at least 1200 mil to actually get a bed through.
Okay. Obviously, being in this space for quite a while, I suppose you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly in the way of SDA delivery. What things have you seen go wrong?
Look, meeting minimum compliance, I think, is a failure.
Yep.
Yeah, and there is plenty of product out there like that. People who are building product with a yield play in mind. I'm going to maximise my yield. I don't want to pay that amount of money. But if you're not putting that sort of stuff into your house, you're not going to get those participants. Poor design is the biggest one. There's not too many organisations, even building companies, out and about in the Perth space that have a really good handle on the design and what flows and what works. Yeah. Just having bedrooms opposite each other and where they position the doors is a really simple solution to be able to manoeuvre people around inside the house. Yeah.
Do you think some people have looked at the most economical way to build rather than the end design for the actual participant?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
and again, reverse engineer the full thing.
Dead right, yeah. Look, we're reasonably fortunate here in Perth in that we have not solid brick, but we have brick construction.
Yeah.
It does make building SDA housing a little bit easier than perhaps on the eastern seaboard.
Yep.
So beware of the new building regime where we are moving to non-brick internal walls and things like that, because it does make your SDA compliance a little bit harder.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Cool. Just for the people that are listening, Perry, can you give us a bit of an idea of the amount of properties you've got under management right now?
We've got a lot more coming than we actually have operational at the moment. We've intentionally kept a reasonably low under the radar type of profile. That will change this year because now we have a significant amount of product in that SDA space coming online. But we have 60 properties around Perth operational with the NDIS at the moment. In terms of vacancy, look, it's fair to say we have no vacancy, but right at this particular moment we have 2 apartments in Como, but they'll probably be occupied within another 7 days.
Right.
So there is a lot of demand. Over and above that, we have 193 apartment beds under construction or in planning.
Right.
40 villas around Perth in various stages of construction that'll have beds for 55 people. We've got 80 houses under construction that are a configuration of 2-bedroom plus OOA and 3-bedroom plus OOA, so about 200 beds in there.
Yep.
And we're producing 15 new houses every month.
Wow.
Yeah, so quite significant.
Yeah.
Anecdotally, we believe we represent about 55% of the total volume being produced.
That's good, man. Well done.
I'm very happy
in the
with
thick of it.
Yeah. I was semi-retired a couple of years ago. I thought this looks like a good idea. I might have a crack at this.
So when we're bringing new product to the market, how long is it taking for you to fill the rooms in these?
It doesn't take very long at all. There's a lot more flexibility in the marketplace at the moment, in so much that there is more participants than there is housing. The challenge within the industry right now, though, is that the people who need the houses don't know where to go and how to find the houses.
Yes.
And it's a problem to the extent that the NDIS themselves have actually created a new department internally to try and connect them.
Right.
Okay, so I'm taking phone calls every other day from the NDIS housing sector, who have clients who have been long-term waiting for accommodation.
Right.
So right now it's not that big an issue, and I think we'll have that window for the next 18 months to 2 years.
Yep.
But then we will start to approach equilibrium.
Right.
Yep.
So how many participants are out there at the minute with approved funding? And then how many do you think we can get in total with approved funding?
2,700 is about where it's going to sit in Western Australia.
Well, that's not much.
It's not, no. Look, of all the people on the NDIS, 7% of those who are receiving NDIS funding will qualify for SDA funding. So it's a small number in that regard, and it will get to equilibrium at some point in the future and then be oversupplied very, very quickly. The NDIS are doing a reasonable job at the moment of trying to manipulate where the properties are going, and you've got to enrol your SDA approved plans at the earliest opportunity now. So before you even start building, you're enrolling plans, and the NDIS is monitoring where things are going and how many are being delivered, so we don't finish up with a oversupply problem or too many in one specific location.
Yeah.
They're also now looking at changing the funding regime to stimulate activity in areas where the yield just isn't delivering, to try and make it more economical or more attractive for investors to actually go into areas like this in South Perth. Unless you're building apartment product, it's just not viable to actually deliver housing or villas, and it's a sort of a conflict within the NDIS as well. They're trying to manage their budget, and in doing so, they're delivering approvals for NDIS funding for types of accommodation that don't exist.
Yeah. I suppose it comes back to when you talked about saturation point and being a saturated market. We go back to delivering the right products, over-speccing them, and not just delivering base product. That's one way to kind of protect yourself and make sure that you've got tenancy once your investment's built.
Yep. Long-term leases as well. This is a VEX issue at the moment also. Right now you can do this, where you can actually align with SIL providers and take out long-term leases with them. But I think those days are going to be numbered probably after the delivery of the Royal Commission into care and so forth. It's a little bit at odds with the choice and control of the individuals. Right. So ideally what the NDIS wants is for all of the individual participants to actually have complete control over where and how they live.
So they should.
Exactly, so they should. But under the head lease model with a SIL provider, they have control of the house, and they can then sublet those houses or those rooms in those houses to their own participants.
Right.
But if the participant then has a falling out with their SIL provider, the legislation is such that they don't have to leave. So it's an interesting situation. So there is a bit of talk that maybe in about 12 months' time, the head lease scenario like that won't be something that's going to be able to be done, but it will be grandfathered through for those who have done it so far.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're busily trying to get as many people on head leases as we can at the moment.
How do the participants get access to the actual NDIS funding? I'm guessing that's not as straightforward as people think, is it?
Look, it's not, and it's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but generally speaking, they would go and find themselves a plan manager.
Yep.
Okay. There's a fair few steps involved in this, and I apologise to all the plan managers who are listening because I've probably got a little bit wrong, but that involves talking to occupational therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, and just bulking up their applications with all this validating evidence as to why this person should be getting funded for SDA or even NDIS for that matter.
Yep.
So an NDIS plan will allow for the provision of care and supports from a SIL provider. It will allow for funding for a support coordinator to manage their relationship connections with people like SDA providers. It will deal with the funding for getting taxis to go out and undertake all sorts of activities. So your plan that you develop with the NDIS through a plan manager, or you can do it yourself, is really where that funding comes from. It's then approved by the NDIS, and they might say, look, we, for example, as much as you want to live by yourself, Neil, you're not going to. We're going to put you in a house with 3 other people.
Right.
Yeah, and this is the funding you're going to get for it.
Right, okay. So the level of funding determines the size of house you can live in, or the amount of other people that are in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
right.
the funding or the actual accommodation options have varying levels of value attached to them per individual. In the apartment space, the highest yielding product is probably a 2-bedroom, 1 resident with on-site overnight accommodation.
Right.
Whereas in the housing sector, it would be the one that will get you the highest rent will be a 3-bedroom or 3-resident house with on-site overnight accommodation. But then it becomes more challenging to actually keep that house occupied with three people. Yeah. 3 personalities can be quite challenging.
Yeah. What's the sort of sweet spot you're seeing?
In the housing sector, we see the sweet spot being the 2 resident plus OOA.
Yep.
And you can still accept people into that particular type of product that don't actually have funding for it, and you're not far off the mark.
Yeah.
So it gives you a lot more scope, a lot more flexibility, and having 2 people living together is much easier to manage than 3.
Yes. Yeah. Try having 6, mate. We have 5 or 6 people living together, so that's pretty tricky. And you spoke about there the highest level of funding for housing is an apartment. What sort of level? What is the funding on a 2-bedroom, 1-participant apartment?
It's a bit of a how long's a piece of string, because it depends on where the apartment is located as well. There is locational factors in there. But look, without holding a gun to my head, the SDA funding for a 2-bedroom, 1-resident apartment, off the top of my head, is about $118,000 a year.
Right.
The NDIS participant will also contribute what they call reasonable rent contribution. You might see that represented as RRC, but reasonable rent contribution is a maximum of 25% of the disability support pension and Commonwealth rent assistance, 100% of Commonwealth rent assistance. So that's about $10,200 on top of the 118. And
wow.
Then you've got the extra bedroom in that property as well, which if it's utilised, the investor has the option of charging whatever rent they want for that. And conventionally it'll be like a market rate around, say, $200 per week.
Yep. Yeah. Interesting. So it can be quite lucrative.
Yeah. $140,000 is not out of the question.
Per apartment.
Yeah.
But not everyone's got the capacity financially or the skill set to build apartments, have they? Which is where the 2-bedroom property with on-site overnight assistance comes in. Exactly,
yes. Yeah, most of your apartment product is actually held and retained by the property developers. There's very little of it individually held out there in Perth. Very, very little of it. There are some smaller boutique-y suburban ones coming into play now that will be 10 and 15 apartments, exclusively NDIS. Yep. They're a little bit more economical to buy and are actually fitting that niche. Yeah. But the sweet spot for the other housing sector is your 2-bedroom property. Yeah,
it's more accessible for investors.
Yep,
easier to fund.
Yep, dead right.
One house, we're not building multi-stories.
Exactly. Yep, dead right.
And what sort of rent are we seeing on the 2-bedders?
Again, depends on your participant level, and that comes back down to high physical support, fully accessible, improved livability. It will range from the improved livability space is about $65,000 a year up to about $115,000, $118,000 for the high physical support. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so great yields.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah, great yields.
And you mentioned as well, depending on the location, so the location can vary that yield as well.
It can. It's not significant in and around Perth. It actually can reduce that yield as well.
if there's oversupply.
Yeah, and we're seeing that already happening in Perth as well. So there is, on the NDIS website, there is the NDIS SDA funding calculator.
Yep.
And it has a predetermined locational zones that will plug straight in whatever that is. And you might find, for example, Mandurah is a 0.98 factor.
There's already too much product there.
Dead right. So they've knocked 2% off the base price.
Right.
If you want to go into an area like Kalgoorlie, you want to build apartments in Kalgoorlie for SDA accommodation, you'll probably get a 20% loading.
Wow.
Yeah. I think Bunbury, when I looked at that recently, was 11 or to 13% loading.
Wow, incredible. Right. I lost for words there.
Yeah. But again, that factor will vary between apartments and houses and villas and in that same location.
Yeah. So before an investor goes out there and says, I want to invest in this suburb, build me an SDA there, the best way to do it, again, reverse engineer it. Is there a way we can see how many participants there is with approved funding in a certain suburb so that it determines how we invest?
Yes. There is, the NDIS have this really cool little site called the NDIS demand map.
Right.
And that gives you exactly how much money they are spending in any specific postcode throughout the entire NDIS. So the best way to actually probably look at that is to factor in that maybe as much, up to about 7% of all of the physical numbers that are on there in terms of people will be SDA. Okay.
Yeah.
In terms of the dollar values, once you get into that SDA space, the values go up exponentially. So it's you can't just extrapolate 7% of those people get 7% of the money.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's really what you're looking for, is that number, and it'll tell you how many people are on the NDIS in any one postcode and how much the government is spending there.
Yeah.
Someone on high physical support funding with SDA funding in their plan as well could have upwards of $1 million a year in their NDIS plan, of which 110 to 115,000 of it will be for SDA accommodation. The rest of it is for everything else they need.
Wow. It's a lot of money, hey?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
But again, much needed. Very much needed. So with your role as the SDA provider, how do you find out from the SIL providers where they have or where they need tenancy? Is that how it's working?
Not really, no. Not really.
Right.
It's probably more driven by support coordinators, and I have many conversations with support coordinators as well along the lines of, I know your client would like to live there, and in the same way I'd like to live in Cottesloe, but that's not going to happen. So we need to manage expectations a fair bit as well. At the end of the day, location is driven by the investor, where it's going to work for them and where it's not going to work for them.
Price point wise,
exactly. Yeah, dead right. It has unfortunately very quickly got to a point where investors are chasing yield. We're trying to, through our business, manage that back a fair bit to the hierarchy of importance. But yield is important.
Yep.
Okay. If you're going to be spending $620,000 on a house and another $200,000 on a block of land, you are wanting to get yield.
Yes.
Yeah. You've got 20 years to actually get your return on investment. So yield is important in that regard. So that's going to be driven by, more than anything else, the land values. Yeah.
The yield is important, but I love the hierarchy of importance, because as important as yield is, without the people in them beds, you're not getting any yield, are you?
Dead right, exactly.
So although you might like a certain suburb, if there's no demand there, then you're probably wasting your time building one there, aren't you?
Exactly, you're dead right.
Yeah.
Look, an example might be, I've had a mother on the phone asking me why we haven't got something in Subiaco. I said, well,
it's $3,000 a square metre for land.
Exactly. The first problem is the value of the land, and the other problem is there's not a lot of demand for it. While you have a need for it, the underlying fundamental there is that people living with disability in more affluent suburbs probably have a support network already in place that works well.
Yep.
And they don't actually have a need for it. So there's not a big need for it, and it's too expensive and doesn't yield, so that's why there isn't any in there. And NDIS does have a connection. There is a very strong correlation between NDIS and socioeconomic positioning in, and a lot of NDIS is lifestyle related as well. So that's why we have much greater numbers in those locations.
Obviously, as we've broken this down and gone through this podcast, we can see the amount of nuances that are there that we need to get right to make sure that this is a successful investment. If people are out there now looking to partner with someone like ourselves or yourself or anybody in that SDA space, what are the questions they should be asking them?
Look, but before you commit to anything, I think you should be speaking to the SDA provider,
Which is yourself?
Yeah, or someone who is an SDA provider.
Yeah.
The next point I'd make there though is in Western Australia, you also need to be a licensed real estate agent. Mm-hmm. Okay, now that's not actually being picked up in the compliance auditing process right now, but I think it will do pretty soon. There are quite a few organisations out there who are registered as SDA providers. But in the West Australian system, and the NDIS is very specific on this, you first must comply with the legislation in the state or territory in which you operate. And that dictates that you've got to be a licensed real estate agent.
You need a trust account and everything.
Exactly, dead right. So there are one or two people waving an SDA flag out there who are not licensed real estate agents and operate on a much smaller scale, don't have the same hands-on experience around that interaction and management side with participants. I think that level of experience is just so important. Look, our thinking and our product design has evolved in the last 2 years exponentially, simply because of that.
Yep, because of your involvement in the trenches.
Dead right. And look, people in our organisation as well. My colleague and business partner Ian Barr has come from a lifetime association with disability. His father was disabled, his son was disabled in a car accident, so he's actually seen this from almost cradle to grave in his experience. So that is very centering, and it makes you a little bit more focused on what is important rather than just the dollars.
Yeah. I'm very similar situation to Ian. My father had Huntington's career, and if SDA accommodation was available in the UK, he would have been in a HPS.
Right.
But because there was no suitable accommodation for him, he was in an aged care facility from the age of 35 to 49.
Yeah.
My sister, exactly the same thing. She's in an aged care facility from the ages of 23 to 35. She's on end-of-life treatment now. And I see the care that they get from the people that work in that facility, but it's total wrong style of accommodation for them.
Exactly. It is.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. And it doesn't actually allow for the provision of the right care either, as much as they're doing what they can.
Yeah. Correct.
Yeah.
What's it feel like when you're seeing the people with disabilities going into a brand new home that's been built for them?
Yeah, it's very good. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. Look, one specific scenario, I won't mention his name, but look, he is what we call tetraplegic. He's got use of his hands. He's actually a high physical support client, but does not actually need care. He's quite independent, but he still has high physical support funding. He is a very, very highly skilled sports shooter. He actually manufactures and designs now gun shooting and sighting mechanisms to fit on wheelchairs for other people with disability. Right. But he became disabled through a meningococcal type of infection that caused him to become paralysed when he was 18.
Yeah, that can kill you as well.
Exactly, yeah. Yes. Now, he's 38 years of age now, so for the last 20 years of his life, he has lived in his parents' garage because that's the only place he could actually go to. And this was in a hilly part of Perth where it was a garage on the ground floor, massively steep driveway down about 40 metres to the road below, and all the facilities in the house are upstairs. So he's been washing in a bucket for the last 20 years, and his food preparation has been microwave ovens. And now he's in this 2-bedroom, 1-resident apartment in Cannington next to Carousel Shopping Centre. And he just thinks he's in heaven.
Yeah.
He's like living in a resort, he reckons. And the excitement in his face, because he'd been to inspect it first, then he's had to come back with the occupational therapist, and the occupational therapist has gone, oh, we need to do this, we need to do that. So all that is being done. And now he just thinks when he picked up those keys, he thought all these Christmases had come at once.
What a change, hey?
Yeah. Same with that lady I was talking about before. She was an MS sufferer. And she is one of these people I mentioned before who will evolve from improved livability to fully accessible to high physical support. But after spending 10 months in Collie Hospital, and they bundled her into a van, and she said 2.5 hours later she's pulled up outside this place in Como, which is... It's got an element of SDA in it, and it's a high-end apartment complex. She just could not believe it.
It's good.
It is. It's fantastic. Yeah. It's how do I use this saying a fair bit, but investing in NDIS housing, it's good for the wallet and it's good for the soul.
Good for the soul.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Perry, we're at the end of the podcast now, but I like to ask all my guests this one. If you had $1 million to invest now, how would you invest it?
I would invest it into NDIS housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Yeah. Which one would you go for?
I would probably spread my portfolio around between SDA house, an SDA apartment, and probably 1 or 2 non-SDA houses for NDIS housing. Because 93% of the people don't get SDA funding.
Really?
Wow.
So what happens with them?
Well, exactly. What does happen with them? We think about half of them probably don't need it because their network will look after them, but the other half need something. So that is another product that's going to be getting a bit more airplay soon. Doesn't yield quite as well. It's cheaper to build though, less compliance at the moment. At the moment, we'll see what happens with that. So again, we've sort of applied our hierarchy of importance in that one, and we've come up with a design and are delivering what we call sill housing now. That is, for all intent and purpose, almost improved livability SDA housing. Yeah.
And what's the sort of floor plan that you're laying out there for that one? Is that a 2x1 again? Or?
No, it's actually a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom where every bedroom has access to a bathroom. So semi-en-suites.
Oh, yeah.
It's more of a group housing type of formula. And within the house as well, there will be a operational centre for the sill provider, so they can be 24/7 care if they need it.
Yep.
But wide doorways, wide passageways, easy access into bathrooms and showers and so forth. Quite big floor plans. Not quite the same funding challenges that you get with SDA, but yeah, it's a good product. Yeah.
And just before we go as well, what about the lending on these things? Do you know much around the lending from an investor's standpoint?
Yes, it's a challenging product for a mum and dad investor who might be looking to minimise their capital input into it. People that don't have a lot of equity in their existing portfolio of property might struggle with it. They will not value under your conventional valuation model. So I think the expectation if you're doing an SDA house is it's probably $150,000 over valuation by the time it's delivered.
Yep.
So if you don't have that $150,000 and an additional 10% deposit on top of that, it's probably not for you. Yeah.
So it's not you wouldn't recommend it for first-time investors. Probably someone that's got a couple of properties under the belt.
Exactly.
Bit of equity.
Dead right. Yeah.
Excellent.
That first-time investor might be more suited to a sill house.
Yeah. Perry, thank you very much for coming on the podcast, mate. It's been a pleasure catching up.
It's been a good test of my knowledge and my acronyms.
You passed the test, mate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you tune in the same time next week so you stay up to date with all the cash flow positive property updates.